That's what I'm talking about, talking about, talking about.
Hello and welcome to Talking About. I'm John Griffith. Cara Kilduff is, as per usual, stuck on the 7 train, and she'll be joining us somewhere in the middle of the show. Hopefully she'll be here momentarily, and someone will be able to get her from the magic lobby that is seriously locked up. And again, you're watching Talking About. Tonight we are discussing something that I've wanted to discuss on the show for quite a while. It's an issue that has been going on for a long time, and surprisingly to many, I'm sure, is still to this day going on at a level that it should not be, in my opinion. And we're talking about HIV criminalization, and I have two very special guests who I'm just going to ask to introduce themselves to you one at a time. If you want to introduce yourself to the audience.
Yes, my name is Robert Suttle. I am a person living with HIV for 12 years, and I'm assistant director of the Sero project. And we are a network of people living with HIV and allies fighting against stigma and injustice.
My name is Jeton Ademaj. I'm HIV positive since 2003, and I work with ACT UP New York and previously with Queerocracy on various issues, including HIV criminalization.
Okay. And I said in the introduction that it's somewhat surprising that this is still going on to the degree that it is. And to the audience who may not know what entails HIV criminalization, can we kind of address an overview of that?
Sure. HIV criminalization is when people who are living, when a person who's living with HIV is accused of not disclosing their status and prior to engaging in any type of sexual act. And so there are laws that exist here in the United States that if a person who is knowingly know that they're living with HIV and they engage in sex, they do not disclose their sex prior to disclosing their status, then they are breaking the law.
Yeah. And do you concur with that?
That would be the primary aspect of it. It's actually a fairly large sort of type of scapegoating where somebody may be even accused. It need not involve sex. There've been laws, and there are still some laws on the books that give draconian penalties for sneezing in the direction of a police officer. A man I know from Facebook a lot more now named David Plunkett was a gentleman who in the course of what apparently was an incident of police brutality, is charged with exposing the officers to his HIV and faces a penalty enhancement of decades that the New York Court of Appeals strikes down, saying you cannot call a part of somebody's body a deadly weapon. So there is this growing phenomena of people being prosecuted for their status, usually in the sexual realm, but not always. And it's an easy way for some prosecutors in some states to get political popularity for themselves. It's a low-hanging fruit. It affects very already disadvantaged communities disproportionately. So there's often difficulty in proving disclosure. There's a systematic erosion of your constitutional rights. You're lucky, God help you if you can be presumed innocent. You basically...
Yeah, that's kind of where, yeah, that's really a raw area in my mind. Is a lot of times it seems to be, from what I've read, guilty until proven innocent, which...
You start out behind the 8 ball, and it's an enormously difficult position to be in. It compounds the stigma of an already incredibly stigmatized disease, and it makes, by all indications, the disease spread. It makes people afraid of testing. It makes people afraid of treatment, and the disincentive even involves irrational decision-making because the legal regime is itself not rational. You can't be HIV positive and be secure that you even have a clear idea of what's expected or required of you in most jurisdictions.
And do you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree with most of what he said. The HIV criminalization laws exist in 30+ states.
I was going to say, I know it's not all 50, but it's over 30 states at this point still?
Which is a large majority of the states that we live in. And so there are states that don't have HIV-specific statutes, but they do prosecute people living, well, they can prosecute people living with HIV and what we call sentence enhancements. And so if they are found out to be living with HIV, that they can definitely get a lengthy sentence.
Okay,
because of that.
So it can elevate the quote unquote crime? Or
Yes, yes. Or the charge, rather.
Okay.
In terms of the history, the move for HIV criminalization in the United States begins sporadically in the late 1980s, and it leaves me interested fairly in sort of digging out the origins of how it starts a bit, because it puts me at odds occasionally with other activists in this issue. In 1992, the U.S. Congress issues the first Ryan White Act, wherein it codifies that if you want this fairly large any part of this money for all sorts of services and healthcare, et cetera, you need to demonstrate that you either have an HIV-specific criminal law or that you demonstrate an ability to use current laws on the books to prosecute cases. And the dynamic I see that this all arose out of is that socially, once HIV testing became available on an easier basis in the mid and late 1980s, society rather casually and systematically shifted to, okay, now we expect you to tell us if you know. But it didn't exactly work to make that easy. In fact, with such a stigmatized disease, people who disclosed typically had a sword hanging over their head in terms of lost jobs, lost apartments, violence and stigma coming at them from all angles. So the society that says, okay, you're going to tell everybody, and if it's a risk to your life immediately or down the line quickly to let it out, that's your problem. Oh, and if you told but you can't prove it, that's your problem, et cetera. And this has been a growing problem all along, that it's become clear needs address. Most of these prosecutions don't put anyone, are for situations where there was little or no biological risk, often no transmission, ambiguous determination of disclosure.
The laws really aren't scientifically sound, at least, especially not at this point in time. Whereas there may have been a limited basis, of science in the early stages when, or at least the perception of it. Am I phrasing that clearly enough?
The issue kind of comes down to what's the role of criminal law in civilization and society, and particularly in a healthcare setting, how useful is criminal prosecution? And I've noted and believe for myself that the consensus point that most reasonable people can agree on is that if there's genuinely intentional transmission, and criminal intent is, particularly in something like I want to pass my disease on, is actually a very difficult thing to prove if you follow the American system of justice like you're supposed to, which HIV positive people start out disadvantaged at accessing. But if you can truly prove intentional transmission, intent to harm, and the harm actually occurred, there is a place where most people, I find, feel that there is a role for criminal law. But that's a very tiny zone, and most prosecutions ridiculously fail that standard. They're just witch hunts.
Well, and at what point are adults expected to make adult decisions about their own sexual well-being and take responsibility for their own actions with their partners? If you're going to go on a hookup app and hook up with somebody and not ask the question, and then you're not on PrEP, or the person is not disclosing, at what point is somebody responsible for their own actions?
Well, everyone should always be responsible for their own personal health. It's just unfortunate that the onus of responsibility has been shifted to the HIV positive person
turn off my phone, I'm sorry.
to disclose their status. What people are failing to understand is that it's not easy to disclose your status. You're not automatically given the skills to know how to negotiate to disclosing your status. And that's very difficult. I think it takes time for whether you're a newly diagnosed person or even someone who's been diagnosed for many years, people still struggle with disclosing their status. But the thing that the society I feel like is not really aware of is that, with the introduction of antiretroviral treatment back in '96 has totally changed things. People now living with HIV are able to live longer and are healthier. And so therefore, as we understand, based on studies that have been done, that those people that are on treatment that have suppressed viral load, they're less and have undetectable viral load, makes them less likely to transmit the virus.
I mean, there are people who advocate that somebody who is undetectable plus somebody on PrEP is almost a zero risk for.
There's not been one case that we are aware of that a person who has an undetectable viral load has actually transmitted the virus to someone else.
Right, and I'm in your court with that, but I would never say impossible. And you didn't say that, and I'm not saying that you did, but I would never say that it's not possible.
Right, there's a risk in everything,
right.
But for now, that has not been proven. Yeah.
It's funny because bringing up the issue of undetectability points to multiple angles, multiple ways that there are a growth of, or a chasm in expectations and underlying expectations between HIV positive and HIV negative people. The HIV prevention begins in an activist community where long before the AIDS is identified as a virus, that there's a determination in the sexually liberationist communities in New York and San Francisco that we need to get ahead of this thing. Richard Berkowitz, one of the three authors, along with Michael Callan and Dr. Joseph Sonnabend, of what's often called the Bible of Safer Sex, How to Have Sex in an Epidemic, One Approach, essentially defined what became the activist mantra of assume everybody's pos, assume everybody's infected with everything, protect yourself at all points, own your status. And yet, once HIV testing comes along, the rest of society moves on from that, and they've never moved back. So there's an interesting study I've been referencing lately in my own work with ACT UP that Dr. Tim Frasca does from the New York State Psychiatric Institute about the ethical considerations between HIV positive and HIV negative men and issues such as disclosure. And what the study observes is that people who in serodiscordant encounters between a pos and an egg, there'd be almost perfectly conflicted underlying assumptions and expectations of the other. The neg person, we didn't talk about it, I assume he's neg. Be against the law. Of course he'd tell me. Positive person, we didn't talk about it, I assume he's pos. This is a dangerous time we live in, and he seems oblivious. And the circumstances of sex can be eroding of rationality. People can act on impulse. People can go with the flow of the moment. And the controversy about undetectability, even in the HIV positive community, became part of this difficulty in accepting the disposition of people to never quite embrace the 1983 paradigm. Condom use never came above maybe 55% for a bump in the mid-90s, but for gay men, who are the demographic that use them the most by far, you're talking about 50% sporadic usage, maybe 20% I used it in my last encounter, more or less evenly since 1988. So when viral suppression comes along is far more powerful and reliable, it also results in this controversy that still continues, where treatment as prevention still gets short shrift. And the reason I push it is because I often think that some of the other, or a good chunk of the criminalization movement uses a civil rights model in the activism. And because again, we are talking about a trait you can't change. When you're HIV positive, you can't help being HIV positive. Right. You're stuck with that. But I'm hesitant to follow on that disposition to just model it on immutable characteristics of other, civil rights struggles and social justice movements, because unlike your race or your sexual orientation or your gender,
right.
HIV is not a benign
Right.
characteristic.
Yeah. I mean, there's only one person who's had their status changed in existence right now, and they haven't been able to replicate that.
And exactly, and just as importantly, it is in the absence of treatment, one of the most fatal viruses ever known to our species. 99.7% fatal, including when you include people with 1 or 2 copies of the genes that Timothy Ray Brown was bequeathed in his bone marrow transplant. So and stigmatized incredibly well for its association with disadvantaged groups. I've found that the terror, the straight terror that a disease that powerful brings in people needs to be diffused first before you can talk about, social justice struggles or how unfair something is. Because overwhelmingly, when I would meet with city council members in New York City as part of Queerocracy, when we wanted the city council to endorse California Representative Barbara Lee's Repeal HIV Discrimination Act, which is kind of unfortunately named, the first question that would come out sooner or later, or a stickling question would be, we're not talking about making it okay to intentionally infect people, right? That's not what's under discussion. And well, no, the issue is you couldn't even say if somebody did it intentionally, because prosecutors often don't care. Go through a string of prosecutions, what was the standard ultimately employed? In Iowa last year, a historic reform occurred in their criminal law where they had one of the most draconian laws on the books, and they reformed it very well after a long slog wherein activists had to, one by one, learn to convince legislators that they were not trying to absolve intentional transmission.
I mean, there is a level of vigilance that is necessary. And I do want to remind the viewers that we are live tonight, 718-460-9802. If you have any questions or comments and you want to chime in on the conversation, we have about 10 more minutes on this topic, and we welcome your participation.
So the concern I have is that activists they assure lawmakers, and a consensus grows, and a very positive thing happens wherein the national effort to reform HIV criminal laws gets a big break, gets its first big yes in hostile territory, with a unanimous vote from both houses of a Republican-controlled legislature and signed by a Republican governor. All of them back this thing. And only for the sacrifice in some activists' eyes, because some activists call this effort a sellout, that a lot was left on the table because some activists feel you must never talk about intent. You must never consider prosecution, and that becomes a concern of mine as an HIV positive man, because in my estimation, that talk dooms the effort. People immediately shut down. They shut down comprehensively.
Is this something that you agree with in your experience as well?
I don't agree. I mean, the reason why I know this issue so well is because it happened to me. I was prosecuted in Louisiana for not disclosing my status to a partner, and the charge was intentional exposure to the AIDS virus. And the way I see it, as I said earlier, HIV is not something that people automatically know how to deal and how to cope with. Unfortunately, many people, especially my community, African American community, especially in the South, where the epidemic is so prevalent, they're not always aware of these laws. They're not aware of the legal implications of these laws. And the problem is these laws are impacting the community of people, a population of people who are already dealing with barriers, facing that adversity, dealing with disparities. And it's unfortunate that there are laws that work against them, it creates undue hardships, makes them sex offenders. In the state of Louisiana, I'm a registered sex offender, and still is for 15 years here in the U.S. And also, you can go to prison up to 30 years. And then you become a convicted felon. And so these just create and add more labels to people that are already marginalized. Whether you use drugs, whether you're a sex worker, whether you have immigration violations, or whatever. If you're a person living with HIV and you have, fallen on these issues, you're going to have more hardship added to your life. And this is not the way, I don't think this is public health's way of solving this issue around HIV. We want people to get tested, we want people to be able to disclose, but unfortunately we live in such a stigmatized community that does not allow for that. And even our legal system, judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, no one understands HIV. They don't know anything about it, so they first have to be educated about the real risk and routes of transmission of HIV. And then secondly, they need to understand the legal implications of these laws and how they really affect a person's life. And so we're basically prosecuting people or criminalizing them for just living with HIV, whether there's real risk or not. And that's what's unfortunate. They're not looking at, I feel like there are different elements that need to be examined. Is this person on treatment? And if they're on treatment, do they have an undetectable viral load? Based on the law, just because you are HIV positive, it's enough to, and you don't disclose it, it's enough to say that that's intent to harm someone. And that is not true. That is simply not true. How can you tell what someone's intent is just based on something that they can't change within them? And I think that in itself is a very unjust way of dealing with this epidemic. And we can't do prevention and prosecute people at the same time. I mean, you gotta do one. And if we want to eradicate this epidemic, if we want to help people and support people living with HIV, then these laws are a barrier to doing that. They don't help. It puts fear in people to get tested, because once you're tested and you find out that you're positive, then who's to say that someone from your past could come up and say, oh, well, you didn't tell me, then they have grounds to prosecute you. So the only defense is if you don't know that you're HIV positive. And people should know their status, and they should not be afraid to know that status and live with that status under these laws that exist today.
I'd frankly like to address the talking point that's often bandied by the rest of the movement, because it's a very dangerous one, this take the test and risk arrest mantra. I don't think it's a great shield to ultimately hide the argument of, because the argument ultimately becomes, should no one ever, under any circumstances, be prosecuted, no matter how much intent they've proven? If they've declared, I want to infect people, and established they genetically tested have in fact infected a number of people, there are activists who say it still doesn't matter, they should never be prosecuted, we got to abolish prisons. It's a long list of more abstract political goals. And in the face of that, I would note that the nation of France and the state of Wisconsin both have explored previously, as other jurisdictions surely will, the legal doctrine of, oh, you didn't get tested, but you should have known. You were so active and so reckless that you've put people at risk already, and we don't care that you didn't know. We think you were avoiding testing, and we'll prosecute you anyway. That's a dynamic that could very easily grow as well, because HIV is the first hyper-fatal transmissible illness that created modern healthcare activism. Is people living with it declared, we're not going into a cage, we're not going into quarantine. The Denver Principles announcing and decreeing that matrix of self-empowerment included social responsibility. HIV-negative people have a 100% personal responsibility to protect themselves, but HIV-positive people have a 100% personal responsibility to not infect anybody else. And that bargain is implicit in the Denver Principles and in the origins of HIV activism. So as the Ebola scare demonstrated even in New York here a year ago, the ability for people to let go of rationality and behave with political panic when it comes to deadly illnesses that affect their most intimate relationships is profound. So simply telling society, oh, you didn't wear a condom with your wife for 30 years and she infected you, no, that's not, we're not blaming you as activists would want you. You didn't protect yourself all the time. You're supposed to trust no one. Society rejects that. So I'm trying to help build a bridge between what's often the coldness of stigma means that HIV positive people don't often get to hear this ocean of stigma and understand its waves and navigate it better. And that's my interest.
I think it's important for people to understand, especially people living with HIV, is that you know, we're not exempt from these laws. The law doesn't care about how you contracted your HIV. You know, I don't care if you're the most honest person to disclosing your status, you still can face prosecution. So,
and accusation.
Right.
And accusation as well. So I think all people living with HIV should definitely be alert and aware and understand that their lives can definitely be impacted by this. So no one's safe, no one is exempt.
Correct.
And I just find it problematic that there are people living with HIV who still support these laws or who still thinks that, you know, there is some relevance. None of us agree that another person should be infected with HIV. We're not saying that. It's just, there is a great injustice in how we are looked at, you know, as criminals because we are living with HIV, and in how in our behaviors around it. A lot of people aren't clear with what behaviors put them in trouble with the law. Sero conducted a survey in July 2012, and the question was, what's the main reason you disclose? Most people live, and it was 2,000 people, with 3,000 respondents, but of that, 2,000 were people living with HIV, and they felt that it is ethical and moral to disclose their status. However, they don't agree that it should be a criminal offense.
Right, and there are a lot of shades of gray. Cara is going to be joining us for the last couple minutes of this discussion now. There are a lot of shades of gray in this, and you obviously both have different approaches, and you're very well educated on the subject, and you come at it from different ways. And I think a lot of it is in educating the lawmakers and educating everybody.
Public, absolutely.
And another thing that we could probably spend a whole other half hour on that we don't exactly have time for today is, it's like, what about the person who doesn't know that they're positive and inadvertently, for lack of a better word, shares it with somebody? Where does that all come in? And
you're just going to have to come back.
Call us back.
We're glad.
When I saw that you guys were going to be guests on the show, and I was reading over the talking points, I had no idea about any of this.
Well, see, that is why we do
it's
education.
A lot of education needed.
It is on, but I think it's broken. No, I was really surprised. I felt so ignorant. Looking at this, and I watched that short film online on YouTube, and I was just like, oh my God.
Yes, and you're not alone. There are many people that aren't as fully aware, and so that's why with Sero we do this work to educate people just about the issue itself.
There's also one thing that should be noted is one additional thing is that just because states do not have an HIV-specific law, or just because you can get them to remove an HIV-specific law, does not mean at all that an HIV-positive person facing one of these witch hunt prosecutions is going to fare any better. One of the horrible truths about these kinds of laws is, for example, that Michael Johnson, convicted and sentenced to draconian 30 years just this July, the prosecution was actually exemplary. The two prosecutors behaved in no perfect machine-like fashion, and because the requirements of Missouri law weren't even that he passed the virus, and disclosure became the central issue in a way that allowed prosecutors to just railroad through his public defender, who was already overloaded and was reported to run out crying. At one point, she broke down.
Wow.
The whole system is stacked against HIV-positive people. On that, we certainly agree.
Right, and you are both going to have to come back because we could actually fill a whole hour on this again. In the beginning of the year, I'd like to have you both back, and we can actually devote an entire hour to the topic because there is so much more to discuss. And indeed.